Mythology and folklore are two things often mentioned in tandem, and though in some cases they are very similar, they aren't the exact same. So what is the difference between folklore and mythology? In order for us to differentiate between the two, we first have to really understand what makes them so similar at their very core. Both mythology and folklore in basic terms are a form of storytelling, perhaps the most ancient forms of narrative we have available to us today. You can consider folklore a subset or a branch of mythology, and even vice versa depending on who you're asking. But more often than not, it does feel like folklore is the small fish in the much bigger pond that is mythology. Where the difference between them can really be seen is within the stories themselves and what they attempt to explain to us. Mythology often derives from what many consider to be sacred text. It aims to tell us about the time before we existed, how we and everything around us were created. These stories were often held as the truth, and so they became part of many people's religion. They discuss deities and supernatural figures that they believed to be involved in our creation. At a time when our scientific knowledge was very limited, these stories provided explanations to things that we've only really began to understand. When these religions lost their following or when they were absorbed into others, they began to be referred to as mythology. So even today's most practiced religions in a couple thousand years from now could be seen as not much more than just stories of mythology. Where folklore differs the most from mythology is in time and scale. Mythology clearly focuses on the beginning of time, the explanation of civilization and culture, whereas the creatures, spirits and deities of folklore almost just exist without this need for a religious or cosmic connection. Folktales are told on a much smaller scale, and often tend to be exclusive to a specific village, town or city. They do at times include gods and goddesses in their stories, but they often do so with a specific meaning or moral in mind that doesn't solely refer back to creation or divinity. The way in which tales of mythology and folklore travelled was naturally quite similar, because at the time they didn't have things like printing houses, and education wasn't as widely available as it is today, meaning many people just couldn't read or write. A select few poets and writers would eventually document these stories, hence why we know so much about certain mythologies on a global scale. Although some folklore was documented in poems and various stories, it remained a more oral form of storytelling. A legend that you might have heard of about a witch or some kind of monster might be quite different, or even remarkably similar to one on the other side of the globe. And it's likely that you'll never know because many of these folktales were passed down through songs and dances. We all have that one story or legend local to our town or city. Japan is quite a good example of a country that has a large amount of mythology and folklore that coexist. It has its two established religions of Shinto and Buddhism, where we get these tales of deities and kami that attempt to explain Japan's creation. But it also has a vast amount of creatures and cryptids that tie into much more local folklore. So to summarize, mythology and folklore are quite similar in terms of storytelling, but the main difference is in intention, what they aim to explain. One attempts to explain the universe to us, and the other is a much smaller scale of storytelling that focuses on specific areas and individuals. Hopefully you found that explanation somewhat helpful. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.